welcome to the June 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm really glad you guys could join us this morning and appreciate your patience as we work through these technical issues. As always, I'm Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic LCC. So we host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. Just to give everyone a chance to ask questions, provide input, keep up to date on what's going on with your cooperative. So the usual agenda, if you're a regular Web Forum attendee, you'll be familiar with this. We usually follow the same agenda, start with just introducing the speaker, who will talk for 30 to 40 minutes about today's topic, and then we'll spend the rest of the webinar on some LCC staff updates, a preview of next month's Web Forum, and an open discussion. So today, presenting, we have Brian Crawford, who is a postdoctoral research scientist with the University of Georgia, and he's going to be talking to us about a project that was designed to assess the statuses of at-risk species in the longleaf ecosystem and inform where and how to invest conservation resources to their recovery. So, Brian, I'm going to pass presenter power over to you, and I'll just need you to hit *6 to unmute your line and go ahead and share your screen.
All right, thanks, Lori. Let me share my screen. All right, so that should be the start. All right, well, thank you, Hillary, and thanks, Rua, for inviting me to give this webinar today. I've been an attendee of these things and a fan for a while, so it's very cool to be able to contribute to the broader efforts that you all are doing in the Southeast here in any way I can. So, and thank you all for making time to come out today. I'm very excited to talk to you about what we've been doing for the last couple months. It's sort of a slow building project, but it's sort of at the point right now where we're really getting going with some cool things. And I'll tell you about some of those in a second. I changed the title of the talk slightly to emphasize what the ARC stands for in a project. So we're borrowing from a lot of groups like CPARC that focuses on amphibian and reptile conservation. But again, that is to accelerate the conservation of some of these really cool herb species we have in the longleaf system in the Southeast. So to give you a little outline of what I'm going to do today, we're sort of going to do a double loop here, and I'm going to go quickly through the background, objectives, and some intended products of this project. And then we'll circle back and go into a little more detail of some of the who and how we're going about this project. So we'll go into a little more detail then and spend most of the time sort of in this inner circle here. And I want to say up front, hopefully no one's too disappointed, but this is an ongoing project. We're sort of more in the front end of it, so the results that I'll share are more anticipated, just to give you an idea of what's to come out. We are definitely still in the methods and sort of the building up stage of it. But I have some good stuff to share, and I think some pretty good progress to share with you all. All right, to start with the background. As many of you are aware, many species in the Southeast are at risk, which means they're petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And upwards of about 330 species need to have decisions whether or not they're listed in the next couple of years. And while, eventually it'd be great to, eventually it'd be great to help the Fish and Wildlife Service with all 330, that seems impossible in the short term. So what our project has done is focused on just 5 species of herpetofauna in the Southeast. And those are the gopher tortoise, gopher frog, striped newt, southern hognose snake, and Florida pine snake. And the reason we chose these 5, we can sort of get into other species that we didn't include if you have questions about that at the end. But all 5 of these definitely share a lot of themes in common ecology, life history, threats, and management strategies that we can focus on and sort of view these as a group, although we do recognize there's a lot of differences between them. So these are out for listing and need decisions in the next 10 years or so. And in the meantime, a lot's been done at the state level. So many of these have state-level protection status across their range, which as a collection ranges from Louisiana to North Carolina in the Southeast. And many states have been doing efforts on a state-by-state basis there's also been more efforts like the South Atlantic LCC to sort of take on a regional approach to conservation. However, we're still at the point where these species, their ranges overlap regions and states and these boundaries that we've set up. So really, conservation efforts are needed across a range-wide scale. And so that's where our project sort of fits in. We're taking a range-wide and species-focused approach to inform conservation planning for the near future. And that is exactly why we're here today. So this project hopes to produce scientific information that will allow our different partners at different agencies and levels across the Southeast to better know where and how they should invest in conservation resources for these 5 species in the Longleaf system. Now here's a view of that range and sort of the expanse of our project. Now together, it's hard to see with some of the overlap here, but together these species ranges go from sort of eastern Louisiana all the way up to North Carolina and then all the way down to Peninsula Florida. So that's the area that, in total we have to capture in this project. And that involves getting partners together from across this range, as well as getting data together and other information from across this range. So definitely an undertaking. Now, underneath that major objective, we have a few key objectives that we're working on. And this is, we hope to have the current project done in about a 1.5-year time frame. That's what we're working with. But we definitely are pursuing further funding, and I'll discuss sort of our hopes for the next stage in a little bit. For now, what we're trying to do mainly is, first and foremost, build a network of partners to share information across the Southeast. Like I said, these species ranges overlap a lot of the jurisdictions that we have set up already that are definitely doing great work, but again, now is the time where we have to sort of go beyond those boundaries of state to state or even region to region. So we're building a network of partners to address 2 other main objectives, and that's one, we need to synthesize every bit of data and knowledge we have on these species in order to build range-wide species status models. That's sort of where this main part of the project is leading. And these status models include predicting species presence or habitat suitability across the range, sort of spatially explicit results to know where and when to manage. And then also these status models include sort of a next level of information, not just where species might likely occur, but how they're doing there. Are their populations increasing, decreasing, staying stable, and so forth. And together, that type of information will allow us to make conservation decisions. So that's the scope of the current work. But then in the future, funding pending, we hope to leverage these species-focused models into more of a structured decision-making framework. And all that means is that across the Southeast, when it comes time to make management decisions, we know that in the end we're going to have to focus more on species. We're going to have to focus on economic impacts and social impacts and things like that. So I think in the current project, we're going to be able to plug in these results that give us really good information about what's going to happen to species under different scenarios, plug that into a framework that then incorporates more of the economic and social outcomes as well, and be able to put that all together and give states and other agencies and groups working in the South really good information as to what to do for these species in the future. Now, with our current project, the end goals, we really see 2 different outcomes or 2 different products from this project. First, we need to create information that's going to inform the species status assessments that are required for both Fish and Wildlife to make actual listing decisions for these. And I want to point out now that our project technically is not the species status assessment. I need to make that very clear. Obviously, it's going, if you know anything about that process, the process we laid out will definitely inform and probably be used in the formal species status assessments, but technically we're not conducting that. But we are going to focus on the same things they do and be able to produce information that says how viable species are now and in the future, and focus on these concepts of the 3 R's that are definitely stressed in the species status assessment. And I'll talk about those in a little more detail in the future. So we see the results of our project informing decisions at the federal level, and then in the meantime, allowing our state and other partners to make strategic, sort of science-based acquisitions, easements, and management strategies. And we'll also focus on what's happening on public and private lands. So in the meantime, before these sort of protective decisions or protective actions are necessary, we think that the products of this project will help inform these sort of more proactive actions that can happen in the meantime. So that was sort of an overview. That was the outer loop of what this project is all about. Now let's dive into sort of what we've been doing, and that starts with who we've been incorporating in this project as partners. So we've been pretty successful in sort of giving the details about what we want to accomplish and having really good buy-in and really generous support from a bunch of different partners in the Southeast. And that includes all these groups on the slide now, including groups at the federal level, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, NRCS. Department of Defense has been really supportive and helpful so far. And then a lot of other groups that act at the regional level, like all three LCCs in the Southeast, the Peninsula Florida one, Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, and then South Atlantic LCC. And then also all of the state fish and wildlife agencies in the Southeast. Lastly, we've been really successful in reaching out to the Longleaf Alliance, TNC, other groups of sort of NGOs, and even private landowner groups in the Southeast. And they're going to be really important to get their perspective, especially when we want to capture what's happening on private lands and what solutions might be, what might we be able to model on private lands and not just your traditional sort of public land management and acquisitions. Now I want to point out that 4 of these groups have provided funding, so I wanted to especially recognize the Southeast Climate Science Center, Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, and Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC for supporting this project even more than the other partners. I also want to say something about the governance structure that we've set up for this project. This isn't just sort of a top-down linear approach like the Fish and Wildlife Service makes, directions of what they need. We sort of sit up here in our University of Georgia ivory tower of academia and do models and then give the results to our states and other partners to implement. That's definitely not what we're after, and there's a lot of good research to say that that's not the best way sometimes. And so this is more what it looks like, how we're going about this project. We're doing a pretty inclusive project and getting all these groups together at the table, quite literally, at the beginning of the project to inform how we do our analysis, what products they want to see, what's going to be most helpful for them, because they're the ones that are going to have to buy into the results and actually implement some of these strategies that come out of this work. So I'm sure I don't need to emphasize it too much with this group, but just wanted to say that we're sort of utilizing a very inclusive and iterative process too. We know that we're not going to get these models right the first time, that I'll talk about in a little bit, but we're going to rely on our partners to give us a lot of feedback, critique our results, and see how they can become better, and then in the end, come up with products that are sort of agreeable for everyone. Getting into a little more of the details of how we're going about this, our 2 other main objectives were bring together all the data we can about these species and develop these status models. So these are sort of the methods we'll use in the middle here, and the inputs to these models are sort of threefold. We need species data, we need landscape and habitat predictors and the relationships between those data and the patterns that we observe and those predictors. And then we need a bit of prior information too from our experts and partners that we're working with. And then on the outside of on the other end of these models, we come up with different metrics that are important to our partners. And we've relied on a lot of expert input, as I said, with that inclusive process to really shape what's going into the models and what's coming out of them. We've done this through direct contact, so I've contacted many people, again, very generous people in the Southeast that have contributed data to build range-wide species databases for our 5 species of concern. And then we've also done things like online surveys and in-person workshops that I'll talk about. The in-person workshop especially was productive. We did that back in February at the annual CPARC meeting, and this allowed us to align our objectives as a group and also review data that we've collected so far and develop important landscape predictors that they really wanted to see go into the models. So let me talk about the sort of the end results that we're hoping for that our partners needed to see first. So at this workshop, we asked our partners and technical team, how are we going to measure success with this project? What kinds of results are informative and feasible? And they developed a lot, and I just wanted to mention a few here. So the products we see coming out of these models are going to be focused on the species themselves. We can determine things like redundancy, which is one of the 3 R's of the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to identify or measure the sort of vulnerability and viability of species. And so redundancy, we can measure the total number and area of sites across the Southeast or across the species range that are likely occupied or with viable populations. We can also measure different sort of habitat and spatial metrics, like what are the effects of different landscape features on species outcomes, because those have direct management implications. We can also assess the representation of these species, so where are suitable sites, where and how are those sites distributed across the landscape and connected. And then lastly, we can develop a lot of comparative metrics that help in management prioritization. So we can assess the resiliency of these species, like the likelihood populations will persist given natural processes and threats that are occurring now, as well as what the resiliency when we sort of model different management and human intervention strategies. We can also, so these other bullet points came up in the workshop that different partners are sort of interested in different things, which is totally fine, but the DoD was very concerned with, what's happening around their bases. So where are the opportunities to purchase the best habitat adjacent to airfields and things like that, because those are things that they're thinking about. And then also, lastly, I think the bottom bullet point is fairly important, and it's important to emphasize that we were glad to have partner buy-in from the beginning, because people are really skeptical about any sort of species model, distribution model. And one thing that was emphasized, metrics of sort of how accurate these models are very important to our partners to trust the results and be able to use them to actually make management decisions. So I've been talking about these models the whole time, but let me actually tell you what we're doing. So we sort of talked with our partners, figured out what they wanted to see out of these models, and we also talked with them about what data was available. And what we ended up finding was that there are 3 types of data for these species that we could use to develop 3 different types of models that together will tell us about their status. So first and foremost is kind of the obvious one. There are a lot of occurrence records of each of these species, and there's enough to build some pretty cool species distribution models to say, where are they existing across the Southeast, where's suitable habitat, and what does that suitable habitat look like. So we're going to develop these species distribution models for all 5. Next, we're going to use some repeated monitoring data from repeatedly visited wetlands across the Southeast to develop occupancy models of gopher frogs. And next, there's line transect distance survey data from about 157 sites for gopher tortoises, and that will allow us to sort of assess their demographics and build some population density models. So in getting to what we've sort of done so far, we've been very successful in extracting species occurrence data from these sources across the bottom. And they include National Heritage Program data sets, state agency databases, and as well as data from academic researchers and HERP Mapper. And altogether, we have about 67 or 68,000 data points across our species, although you see the distribution is a little lopsided. So next we wanted to think, so with this data in hand, we next needed to think about what landscape predictors we might use to model where populations of these species are and how they're doing. And for that, there's an infinite number of landscape predictors that we can put into these models. And so what we did was actually go back to our partners, the experts that are working on the ground with these species, and we used this online survey to survey about, it was 28 experts working in the Southeast. And we gave them this question, which I absolutely stole from the Peninsular Florida LCC after I attended a workshop where they sort of focused their discussion around this. I just love the way they put it. I think it sort of takes this very complex idea and breaks it down in a very simple way. But we asked our experts, say you're walking through an ideal habitat for gopher tortoises. What makes it ideal? What are the measurable features of that landscape that make it a good habitat? And so from this just shows the results for the gopher tortoise. We were able to come up with sort of a prioritized list of metrics that we could put in our models. Not all of these are mappable or measurable. Partnerships came up as a pretty important one for a couple people. That's sort of an inherent attribute of this project. But a lot of these other ones are absolutely measurable and mappable. So we can map ground cover, sandy soils, canopy cover, fire interval, land cover, etc. And what we've done is use these to go out, see what data is out there, and develop different landscape metrics that we can use in our models of species distribution. And that's just to show you many of these, sort of what they look like. These are a handful, just a handful of the metrics that we've been able to find data for that our experts identified as extremely important for these species. And so what we can do is overlay our species data, these points here, with different barriers like major roads and major waterways, and then overlay those with other landscape predictors like soil drainage class, elevation, different metrics of what the canopy and understory looks like, what the land cover looks like, and what fire disturbance looks like. Those are all very important factors for these species. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. We're also working on some others. And one in particular is measuring connectivity, which the LCC spends a lot of time thinking about. So this is not done yet, but I wanted to show you this gnarly-looking map, how we're thinking about connectivity for some of these species, because it's sometimes pretty complicated. So thinking about our amphibian species in particular, these are ephemeral wetland breeding critters. And what you see in the light blue here, those are all the actual wetlands that we got from the National Wetland Inventory database. And then around them, what you're seeing is basically a distance to wetland layer. And what we can do is remove all the areas that are further than 250 meters away from wetland. And what these little blobs of purple show are wetlands that are connected within 500 meters of each other, which is about the movement range of the striped newt. It's definitely within the movement range of gopher frogs. And so, in other words, we can sort of use these wetlands and the distance to them to identify networks of wetlands where these species might persist in metapopulations. Now, this is important because our partners have identified, there's a lot of literature as well as our partners identified how these species of amphibians persist much better when there's multiple wetlands, and they can sort of utilize a metapopulation structure. And so we can use these networks of wetlands to say, what's the likelihood of finding gopher frogs or striped newts in a wetland network that looks like this versus sort of an isolated one like that, or a really big one like that with a lot of little pockets that they could breed in. So we're still developing those connectivity measures, but we definitely know we want to focus on the connectivity of wetland to wetland and also wetland to upland and upland to upland. So a lot of dimensions there, the connectivity metrics that we need to have in these models. And within these networks, we can do things like calculate the number of wetlands, total area, and then also the variation in wetland size, because our experts said they think that's really important for these species, to have different wetlands of different hydro periods, so that depending on the year, the annual precipitation conditions can sort of be balanced out from year to year, and they can always have somewhere to breed, at least. We also spent some time in that workshop talking with our experts about sort of the nuances that we need to incorporate in these models. When you're dealing with when you're trying to model a species across its range, a lot can change. And another great example of that is the gopher frog. So we know from the study by Stephen Richter et al. That gopher frogs down in Peninsular Florida are actually genetically different than the rest of their range. There might even be 2 lineages down there. And as you can see, there's a lot of blue dots here. Those are gopher frogs. They're doing pretty well in Peninsular Florida. So when we model the species across the whole range, maybe we need to treat this section a little differently. Maybe there's something going on there, even on a genetic basis, that we might be able to sort of tease out and account for in models, so that we're not just sort of treating this group the same as this group. Another reason why that's important is that we know that gopher tortoise burrows are mainly used by gopher frogs in the south part of the range, but in the north, they don't overlap with gopher tortoise burrows. So we can't, put that as a predictor in the model and expect anywhere up here to come out as suitable habitat. So we just need to account for these ecological differences, and sometimes even genetic differences across the range of these species. And as I said in that workshop, it was especially beneficial to get groups of experts across the whole Southeast together and really give some good opinions about what they're seeing in their species when they go out in the field down in Florida versus what somebody's seen out in Alabama and up in North Carolina. It was just some really great conversations that we're going to be able to implement, into our models and account for some of that variance. So we have our species data, we have a good understanding of our landscape metrics that need to go into the models, and then lastly, we did something a little different. We actually did this expert input mapping exercise, which I know the LCCs do a lot, but we did it through Google Earth, and what we gave to our experts was a sort of smattering of known species locations in their state. And we said, okay, this is everything we know. Can you tell us anything about the areas we don't have data for? And what we asked them to do is circle anywhere where species are likely absent. So, for example, this person circled these 3 WMAs. Now, maybe the expert had been there, hadn't found the species, but that doesn't necessarily get recorded in any data set. So this allowed us to get some really good information for pseudo-absences or likely absences that we can use to improve our models. And we also said, all right, where do you think they're likely present, but we just don't have the data for? So this person circled this WMA and said, based on what they've seen, what they know, it's very likely that we might find that species there. And so what we can use these for is run the models, figure out sort of habitat suitability and likelihood of presence, and see how this area compares with what those results say. Hopefully they're sort of agreeing, but if they don't agree, what's wrong? Is something wrong with the model, or does the expert have to sort of reconsider, maybe this isn't suitable, so forth. But it gives us some really good information to use in the models moving forward. So that's all focused on what we've done to put the pieces together that are going into these models, and also how we've sort of identified targets that we want to have come out of these models. And I guess just for the last few minutes of the talk, I'll give you a taste of what we expect the results to look like. So for species distribution models, I'm sure many of you are aware of sort of what results you can get from these models already. But the main questions for conservation action that we can answer with these models are things like what and where is suitable habitat for species, and then where are priority areas, what is their protection status. So we can develop pretty maps like this and focus on identify areas that are really suitable. This is based on some NRCS gopher tortoise suitability rankings. So nice big dark green suitable patches down here. The Okefenokee is here, so that's not very suitable. And we can just sort of figure out spatial targets for where we want management priorities to take place. And then we can zoom in and focus on more discrete areas and say, all right, well, this big region is protected, this region isn't, but this region is actually appears like it's more suitable, so maybe we could focus on acquiring areas next to these protected areas, maybe bridging them out to incorporate more of the suitable habitat. So it'll allow us to help our partners make decisions like that. But next, we don't want to stop there because there's only so much you can do with those species distribution models. And for the gopher frog and gopher tortoise, we can actually add an extra layer of information to make even better prioritization sort of decisions. So with the occupancy models, we actually are able to do something a little different. We can predict where populations aren't just likely present, but where they're persisting or declining or growing in the future. Now, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. The data that we're using in these models comes from the field, and it comes from, again, these repeatedly monitored wetlands where people have gone out year after year, and they've recorded two different things that we're going to use in these models. For gopher frogs, they recorded, one, if they found gopher frogs there or heard them calling, found adults there or heard them calling. So that's like, is the species there? Is it sort of using the habitat? And then next, they recorded if they found evidence of reproduction. So they found egg masses or so forth. And that is sort of a different level of information because many frogs can use wetlands, but actually all the reproduction could fail based on the hydro period and things like that. So having those two sources of data allows us to separate what is the best habitat that's actually reproductively viable versus, those marginal habitats that species might be using but maybe not be contributing to the population. So for example, we might find that this network of wetlands has really high likelihood that the species is there, but a really low likelihood of reproduction. And then we can compare that to this sort of bigger network of wetlands over here where it's got similar levels of presence. The species is about as likely to be there in any given year. However, the rate of reproduction is a lot higher. So again, this is giving us that extra level of information to make prioritizations if we had the real basic choice of should we invest in conserving this network of wetlands versus this one based on this information. We would choose that one. Finally, for the gopher tortoise, we have a lot of really good line transect distance data, which allows us to, again, separate the habitat that's sort of marginal to the habitat where we're actually seeing population growth and stability. To give you an example of what that looks like visually, many state wildlife agencies have funding to do these line transect surveys across their state in different WMAs and different areas of concern. And so these sort of shaded boxes describe the site boundary, the lines are the transects that they walk, and the little green points are where they saw gopher tortoise burrows. And so with this data setup, we can get a lot of things like how likely they are to detect species in each of these zones, and then also estimate the density of a population here versus one here versus one here, and so forth. And that estimation of density will be able to really allow us to project these populations in the future and see where species growing versus where they kind of just hanging on but not really doing well. So to wrap up here, where we're going with this in the future, we've definitely been able to build a network of partners, but we want to keep expanding that one. And we're going to sort of more formally engage a lot of partners from the Longleaf Alliance and Longleaf Partnership Council and other NGOs and private lands. And we plan to do a second workshop in the fall of 2017. Hopefully we'll have more results to share by then and have that first round of giving everyone sort of preliminary results, having them look at the map and say, oh, well, like, this is wrong here, this is wrong here, this is okay here, and help us be able to improve these models in the next round. And we also want to get their perspectives on sort of landowner goals, things that we haven't really captured so far, and also what management practices are out there that they want to see modeled in the future in this project. So what are the different strategies that we can model and predict what is going to happen to these species under X, Y, and Z management practices? So we're going to do this iterative process, update our models by the technical team, and provide provisional results for our partners in a couple different workshops between the fall of this year and spring of 2018, and hopefully wrap it up by August of 2018. And then again, funding pending, we hope to leverage those results into a more formal decision-making framework with our partners and incorporate more of the economic and social outcomes of these different strategies that we've been able to model in this stage. And again, what that information for conservation planning might look like is we'll be able to help our partners determine what and where is suitable versus maybe the best habitat for each species. What are the species ranges? Where are they growing or declining? And then what are priority areas for different management actions? Where should acquisitions be? Where should easements be? Where should direct sort of augmentation of supplementing populations be? That's an option for the gopher frog and and gopher tortoise. And we think that might be something that our partners are interested in as well. So a ton of good information that is potentially coming out of this, and again, incorporating that into a full decision-making framework would be great in the future, and something we're very interested in. So with that, I can turn it back to Hillary for Q&A moderation, but thank you again for your time, for being here, and I'd love to hear any input at all you have. This is a very flexible project, and like I said, we're in the early stage, so plenty of time to incorporate any new ideas that we get. So thanks again for y'all for listening, and yeah, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we have probably 8 to 10 minutes to take questions, so please don't be shy. Just remember *6 to unmute your line, or you're welcome to use the chat box if you prefer. No questions? Okay, John Edding has a question. Go for it. Just *6 to unmute, or I can read it from the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Great. Thanks, Brian, very much. This was really interesting. I wanted to ask if you all had attempted to address issues of syncing your species occurrence data with the environmental data, and by that I mean, as you know, some of the environmental data can be quite dynamic over time, especially, you showed an example of fire recency data that can change frequently from year to year. Land cover and roads data is going to change less frequently, but over a period of 10 or 20 years, you could see quite a bit of change. How do you address that versus your species occurrence data, which probably, depending on what criteria you might have used, can span 50 to 100 years?
Yeah, that is a great question, John. The short answer is we will probably have to sort of make the best of different things here, but we definitely have species occurrence data from all the way back to, I don't know, I saw some records from 1900 in that. Right now we've separated out from sort of just put a somewhat arbitrary criteria of anything before 1980 or we might change that, but we sort of separate out from historical and current data. But you're absolutely right. Like, I don't know what other people do when taking on that issue. I haven't read enough about it, I'll admit. But I think that we need to just be careful and build models that are representative of at least. So we have a lot of good information from some of these data sets about where things haven't changed. I'll say that much. A lot of these come from sort of government DoD lands and SREL, for example, the Savannah River site in the southeast, and a lot of those data points, the habitat around them, we don't expect to change, even if they're from 1980, 1960, so forth. But I guess I was going to cross-reference, before we sort of build any models, I was going to cross-reference some of the data points that we think are current with land cover change layers, or things that would give us some indication that, there was a pond here, and that's where this species was collected, but that was back in the 1960s, and now it's an apartment complex. So some of those major changes will show up, at least somewhat, on some NLCD land cover change databases. But for other things like fire disturbance, that's a good one that we've talked with the LCC about, because Rua and some of his partners have been doing species distribution models and using different land fire disturbance data sets. And my understanding is that some of those layers will say, the layer you see in the bottom right here, for example, this shows fires within the last 10 years. And my understanding is that people have used that as an assumption, like they've assumed that means that that area is somewhat regularly burned. Again, it's a big assumption, but you can sort of extrapolate that backwards in time and say that species that were found in that location have sort of been under a regular fire regime for at least a decade or two. But again, it's going to take some assumptions. I thought you were going a different way with that question, because a lot of our data has been collected on roads, and that's always a big problem with these species distribution models, where if you're not careful, you might find that roads are a positive predictor of species presence, and it's not exactly reality. It's not really what we're after. So we have thought about how to sort of mask out any species data that was collected on a road, and sort of mask out the habitat around the road, and or mask out the road itself and focus on the habitat around the road, things like that. But for the temporal thing, again, I need to read more about what people do. It's been an issue from the start, and we're sort of just getting enough information to be able to play around with these models. And I'd love to talk to you or anyone else more if they have any ideas about how to do that.
It's something, we're on a modeling team that's doing some work for the South Atlantic, and it's something we've been kind of struggling with. So
yeah.
Any good ideas you guys have, we'd love to hear and be happy to share back and forth.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we'll be hearing about John's project next month, actually. So,
nice.
Yeah. Back-to-back Longleaf for species presentation. So I do have another question from the chat box. Are there any concerns about having that information on the location of rare species that are being petitioned for listing, or perhaps might be close to being listed?
Concerns about showing that in any particular context, or just in general?
I think the question was pretty general, but I got the sense that maybe disclosing information that we might not want to have, site-specific locations of species that people might do nefarious things with that information. Cindy, if I'm misinterpreting, please feel free to chime in.
That sounds like a pretty good question. So we have a lot of signed data agreements already with our different data providers and state agencies, that the results, we definitely are going to be careful, first and foremost. And we, depending on who we're talking to, if any presentation like this or paper or any product is made, we are not going to disclose specific locations because of the risk of potential, there's a lot of conflict with at-risk species, but also these herbs are very prone to collection for pet trade, for harvesting, landowners that just don't want them in their land, all that stuff. We don't want to give away sort of lat-long specific information. But with our partners, we can sort of, with these site-specific results that I mentioned, the scale of those is going to be kind of at the parcel or at a rougher scale that, it's just going to say, it's not going to say where species are, it's going to say where habitat is suitable. Or, other metrics like where populations are likely to be existing or declining. And we do have to be sensitive to the audience and who we're talking to, but for some of our partners, having that site-specific information is going to be necessary to make some of the decisions they need to do. So, yeah, I guess it's audience dependent, but definitely we are not going to disclose that site-specific information in any public document, for sure.
Great, thanks. I have one more out of the chat box. Is it the intent to utilize existing program like NRCS EQIP to capture the private landowner aspect of this model to help incentivize management of these species on private lands?
Great question. So the next round, that workshop I mentioned coming up in the fall, is the one where we're going to focus on what management and incentives fall under that sort of really broad umbrella of management. We're going to discuss what management strategies are out there and what strategies our partners want to see modeled, if they can be modeled, at that fall workshop. So we do have NRCS as our partners, and we've been working with Melissa Martin there. Mostly the focus has been their Working Lands for Wildlife program and how to better use these results to inform where they sort of do some of the Working Lands for Wildlife efforts. I'm less familiar with the EQIP program, but there might be some overlap there. It sounds similar. But I think that fall workshop is where we're going to develop sort of a brainstormed list of management strategies that our different partners are already implementing across the Southeast, and how we might plug them in to these different models to predict some outcomes for these species. So that's probably going to be in the conversation in the fall, is my guess.
Great. Unless anyone has another burning question, I think I'm going to move on, but I'll pause in case someone wants to sneak one in. All right, so I'm just going to wrap up quickly with with a preview of next month's web forum and just some quick updates from LCC staff. Once I get sharing again here. Thank you so much for that great presentation, Brian. Appreciate everyone participating in the Q&A. That was awesome. So next month, as I mentioned, we're going to be hearing from Ann Chazelle and John Edding from Florida Natural Areas Inventory, who is on the phone, and with Virginia Natural Heritage Program. And they're going to be talking to us about another project that was funded by the South Atlantic LCC to develop species distribution models to help incorporate data on 10 different rare species into the blueprint. Those are the frosted flatwood salamander, the smooth coneflower, the southern hognose snake, pondberry, gopher frog, Curtis loosestrife, striped newt, Piedmont fameflower, Michaud's sumac, and chaffseed. So this project is drawing on model products on other available data sets to develop and synthesize information on kind of the conservation and management needs of those species. So that webinar is intended to be an overview of methods and progress to date. And the goal of that work is to integrate into the conservation blueprint so that the blueprint can more closely support efforts to conserve current and future habitats for these range-restricted species. John, since you're on the line, did you want to add anything?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we should have what I would think will be near final models to show at that point. Right now, we have draft final models that are under review by experts, so unless we get some dramatic feedback from them that we need changes, then we'll be able to show some final stuff.
Well, that's fabulous. Yeah, I imagine that would be something of interest to anybody who was on the line tuning in for this webinar. Definitely a lot of shared aspects there. So this will be on the 20th of July at 10 a.m. Normally I say same time, same place, but given our connection information snafu this morning, stay tuned, check the calendar event, check your reminder email to make sure that you're connecting to the right place. So 2 quick updates from LCC staff. I wanted to do a preview of some improvements that are in the works for version 2.2 of the blueprint and some improvements that are in the works for the simple viewer. So your staff have been hard at work making some changes to version 2.2 of the blueprint in response to the feedback that we got on the draft at our workshops this spring. Rua, would you like to talk any more about this?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so we're working out we fixed some issues in the new runs with some historic area prioritization, and we're actually looking at some issues around some forested wetland areas that folks weren't thinking were coming out high enough. So we've made a few improvements in some new runs, and we're working on a couple of other things, including some corridor categories and some rebalancing. Based on all the feedback we got. So we'll see what pans out in time for the full update.
Thanks. And then as far as the viewers, one thing that we heard a lot about at our workshops was making it easier for folks to see why a particular area is a priority in the blueprint. And we're working on a few new features with that, including a new pixel level analysis that would really let you examine what indicators are driving the priority for that particular pixel. And we're also looking into some custom summary units, so potentially the ability to maybe import a shapefile and do analysis on that area rather than just looking at the watershed summaries that are available in the simple viewer now. And ideally, we'd love to be able to export a report on the results of that analysis. So those messages came out loud and clear at the workshops, and that's hopefully a preview of what's in the works. All right, so other than that, I'd just like to end on this slide. Please, would love to get you more involved in the cooperative. I encourage you to join the website. That'll get you signed up for the newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You're always welcome to connect with staff like me or Rua who are on the line, or other members of the cooperative. And of course, we'd love for you to explore the conservation blueprint, and we're here to help support you in that if you think it's relevant to your work. So with that, I think it's 11 o'clock, so appreciate your patience with the technical issues again, and hope you'll tune in again next month. Thank you.